Hi, we continue in Luke 14 as Jesus offers examples of the cost of discipleship. So, to situate ourselves where we've been, we can see we're in the journey to Jerusalem chiasm on the return route here, which to say, after Jesus expresses lament over Jerusalem at the center of the chiasm, we're now bearing down on Jerusalem. So, our passage here in the magenta section here is parallel to the fig tree parable in chapter 13, and then we'll continue throughout all the way to Jerusalem. We've been looking at the key words in this section. The main issue is cannot be my disciple. And as I'll show you in a second, that frames the chiastic shape of this passage that we're looking at, and that's the central theme here to the crowds. And our sequence that we've been looking at here, now we're reaching the very end, where in these sections here, after the banquet instructions here about where you can get seats or not, and whether seats matter, and who you invite to a banquet, which does matter, now he's speaking to the crowd in these three little sections here about the cost of discipleship. We looked at this one last time, and now we're looking at this one. We'll see if we get to salt and possessions next time. This time, probably not. So here's the shape we've been looking at, and as I was noting that last time, it's not a traditional chiasm in the sense of words that are parallel, it's more thematic as we're seeing. So we looked last time at 14:25 to 27, these two requirements of discipleship, rejecting family and the cross, and then we'll see next time on these two other requirements of discipleship, saying goodbye to possessions and somehow being like salt, even though Jesus doesn't quite say that. And now we're looking at these central pieces here. The first example of bad elite planning around the tower, and the second example around war, all around this central message. And noting the details here, that people will say, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish, and this fellow being a pejorative word, and there's other elements we'll look at when we get there in just a moment. So mainly the issue is being people will make fun of you and ridicule you, dishonor you as a Roman if you claim you're a follower of Jesus, but you just can't do it, and you try to come back with your tail between your legs. So that's what's at issue here. And Jesus saying this to the crowd, whether we think of that as the Jesus historical crowd, many of whom would probably not be rich people and would hear this as kind of a sarcastic element, although he's addressing it to you, to the audience, not just which kind of person. So he's saying it to them, and really for Luke, that means the crowd here is not just Jesus' crowd, but Luke's audience, his young adult Romans, as I've been saying, that are being trained to follow the Roman way and take their place. And Luke is trying to persuade them here desperately almost to say that Jesus' way is the more life-giving way for them and for everybody else. So we saw the challenge last time around the Roman family and the issue of hate as rejection, and the cross as daily taking up the commitment that I am dead to the Roman Empire. And so now he offers these two examples we see. For which of you, and then highlighting the you element, and this will be echoed in 15:4, so we'll see the which of you around the lost elements as well. Intending, or using thello here, wanting or wishing to build, and we've seen building a number of times, and plainly ordinary people can build as well, but what we've been seeing often is the building that requires money. And one of the key elements here is building on the foundation that we'll look back to here in 6:48 and 49 when we get to foundation here. So it's built a tower. And biblically, tower invokes the Tower of Babel, of course, from Genesis 11 in multiple views. Whether that's what Luke has in mind is another question. That was not a one-man building project, although no tower is a one-man building project. The only one-man building project like that in the Bible is Cain building the first city and naming it after his son Enoch. But that's obviously a little political cartoon. So many people are required to build a tower. As my note below has, Vincent suggests the farm tower from which to watch for thieves. Here's one of those, like a watchtower. That's one kind of local tower that someone can build, but the Romans were into towers. Here's the Tower of Hercules in Spain, which would been a huge tower, and obviously not an individual project, whether that was built by patrons, local patrons as an expression of their loyalty, or whether that's financed by Roman money to celebrate the locals in a patronage relationship, I can't say. But there's that kind of tower, and of course the most famous Roman tower is probably the Leaning Tower of Pisa. But notice that all three of those, these are huge projects, and to have one of these partway built, whether it's protecting your personal property from thieves or animals, or honoring the gods as a city beneficence, stopping it partway would plainly be an embarrassment. So who would build a tower who's not first sit down, using the verb kathazo, which means the ordinary sense of sit down. I'm sorry, my note below, I've lost track of who that was from, but whoever it was noted that it conveys the idea of settling down to make a deliberate calculation. And it's not just this word that says so, the word for estimate does as well. phesazi only here in Revelation 13:18, which is about calculating the number of the beast. So plainly, it's talking about doing arithmetic here, sitting down and counting the cost. Dapanen, only here in the New Testament. So literally it's about calculating the cost in advance to see whether he has enough to complete it. Apartismon, only here in the Bible. And we'll see there's a couple of different words for both, for the cost and for the question of completion. So which one wouldn't do that first? And the plain implication is nobody would. Nobody would start to build a tower and not figure out in advance, can I afford to do this? So he's basically saying only a fool would start something without calculating in advance whether you can complete it, right? Not maybe in our high-tech world where it's fake it till you make it, but certainly that wouldn't be so in the Roman world. Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation, themelion here, and that's what evokes 6:48 and 49 here at the very end of the Sermon on the Plain. Let's go back to that for a moment. The one who is faithful is the one who is like a man building a house who dug deeply and laid a foundation on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against it. The house could not shake it. So the foundation on rock is plainly the gospel of Jesus. Whether we think of that formally as the church built on rock, which is to say Peter, is a separate question. But plainly, the foundation is the gospel. And so if one's foundation, he's laid a foundation on the gospel, but is not able to finish it, people will laugh. The word for not able here is literally not strong enough, and we looked in chapter 13 at the issue of not being strong enough, and so I want to highlight that here, because there are two words for that would certainly be embarrassing and shameful for a Roman man, not to be strong enough, and as we'll see in another minute, not to be powerful enough. So not to be strong enough to finish what one started. So back to here, to finish is another word for complete, ektelese here, or literally to complete out, only here in the next verse in the New Testament, 4 times in the Septuagint, but not related. And all who see it, notice the public perception here is what's at issue, will begin to ridicule him, using empizane here. And as my note below has, just as the elite Pharisees would be shamed by the new presence of one with greater honor, so elite disciples would be shamed by the inability to carry out their discipleship. That is, the invitation of the poor cannot be made simply as a reaction against the rejection of the invitation by the elite, but out of a calculated commitment to follow through. And consider Ananias and Sapphira. And so let's do that. So we hear from Acts. Ananias, Peter asked, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back part of the proceeds of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, were not the proceeds at your disposal? How is it you have contrived this deed in your heart? You did not lie to us, but to God. And so plainly what's at issue here, as we were looking at last time, is this is voluntary. If you've started it, you've got to finish it. But if you don't think you can do it, then just don't do it. And we talked about this more last time. So you want to know more about why Jesus isn't threatening people with hell if they don't sign up to be Christians, you can look at the last video. And so at the center of our chiasm here is what people would say. This fellow, using hautos, a derogatory term, and we'll see that also in 15:2 and one other time, began to build, and here was not strong enough to finish. And that's what we see here. So let's look at the second example. That's at the center of it here. And as Marshall notes, on this one, the lesson is, it's contrary to the idea that, quote, the lesson is that one should come to terms with the enemy before it's too late, and plainly that's so. So Marshall's saying that several decades ago. Or what king, which plainly is not suggesting kings are in the audience, but that the audience would be familiar with this kind of strategy, so it really puts them among the elite. Going out to wage war, using the military use of symboline here, to call together for war against another king. And you can see it just like this, where you're standing. This is not the moment in this scene to make the decision when you see them coming with the 20,000. So which one, going out to wage war, will not sit down using the same word as we saw last time, and consider using a different word here. Boulesetai, to take counsel or deliberate. And the noun form boule is what in Acts will be referred to as the boule of God, the plan of God, of which Jesus is the expression of that. So here would take counsel or plan whether he is able, in this case, whether he is powerful enough. So the tower building is a question of whether he's not strong enough, and that's what the public would ridicule him for. He's not strong enough to finish what he started, and now the issue is that he's not powerful enough with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000. And the other use of the word hupantasai in Luke is a key one. In 8:27, we heard it here. As he stepped on the land, a man of the city who had demons opposed him. It's described as met here, but the same word. And man with the demons, as we'll find out, is the Roman legion. And so it's precisely the same issue. The 10,000 opposed by the Roman legion, or the other way around, if one is representing the 10,000 represents the legion and its supporters, and the 20,000 perhaps the Persians, the enemies of the Romans to the east. However we might fill that in, if someone is doubly outnumbered, it's too late now to negotiate. But as we hear, if he cannot, then while the other is still far away, farther away than in this scene presumably, he sends a delegation, or a presbya here, literally like a group of elders, and asks for terms of peace, literally to ask for the things that pertain to peace, which provides one intratextual echo inside Luke and one intertextual echo into Deuteronomy. Let's look at the intratextual one. So asking for the terms of peace, when Jesus completes his journey to Jerusalem, we hear this, saying to Jerusalem, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Which is to say, Jerusalem ultimately is the one, or at least those who took up the war against the Romans, who did not calculate the cost when they took up the battle against the Romans in the 60s, and of course in 70 the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. And the phrase here for terms of peace, we saw that there, the asking for, though, echoes Deuteronomy 20:10. We saw Deuteronomy 5-7 in the previous scenes, where the three excuses for not coming to the banquet echoed excuses for not coming to battle. So just a couple of verses after that, we hear in Deuteronomy 20:10, when you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. If it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all the people in it shall serve you at forced labor. If it does not submit to you peacefully, if it makes war, then you besiege it. Notice in the Deuteronomy example, it's not exactly parallel, just like it wasn't parallel a few verses earlier in the same chapter in Deuteronomy around the excuses, because they weren't excuses for a banquet, they were excuses for not going to war. Here, the presumption is that you have the advantage, and so you can offer terms of peace as the advantage, offering terms of peace. In our example back in Luke, we see that the issue is that the person who knows they're losing asking for terms of peace. So it's flipping it around the other way. So we have time, might as well just keep it going here. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. And one might ask, how does that follow from the question of building a tower or preparing for war? So we have to look at the details here. So the none of you is plural here, so highlighting the parallel and the chiasm, cannot become my disciples. But this is where we have to look at some details. If you do not give up your possessions, can be translated, separate yourself from all that is you. Let's look at some details of how we get there. Give up, apodisatai here literally means to say goodbye, to let go of. And the word for possessions is what's key here. It's from a verb, huparko. So ha huparko, the things that you possess, or the things that are yours, or the things that belong to you, something like that. So if we look at the use of the verb, we see a number of times here how it's used in various other ways. The pink ones are where it's translated as a form of the verb to be. And so we see that there in that broad sense. The green is where it has to do with physical things. Again, remember it's a verb, so it'd be the things you possess, or the things that belong to you, which is to highlight that what's at issue is possession. The issue isn't the things, the issue is claiming ownership. And so that's why the key is in Acts of the Apostles. The one time it's used here and related to this kind of meaning. The whole group of those who believed were of one heart and life, not soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. That is the point. The point isn't that Luke wants everyone to have nothing, otherwise you couldn't throw a banquet and invite the poor, etc., and many examples of that. The issue, as we see in Acts, is to stop claiming it your own, to stop claiming power over things, as if that's the point of life. But the things are all gifts, and so you say goodbye not to the things themselves, but to your ownership over them, and therefore you can be part of this reality because you don't have to worry about the cost, because the cost is shared. Whether that's literal financial cost like building a tower, or whether it's a cost in terms of relationships, as we'll see in Acts of the Apostles. So it ends with a metaphor that has led many scholars to be confused, but recent work has highlighted what this is really about here from Bradley in 2016. So he notes that salt properly used was a fertilizing agent for soil. The issue is not so much taste, literally is the taste, as the taste as it symbolizes deterioration of the compounds that support soil fertility. And it has to do with the variety of minerals that salt would be in the Mediterranean. So salt itself is good, kalos, here used a number of times. But if salt has lost its taste, and this is what's at issue. So the Greek word maranthe at one level can mean to make foolish. It's only here in Luke. But it's used that way in 1 Corinthians, as God has made foolish the wise. And so if salt has become foolish in the sense, which is to say lost its power to do what it's meant to do. As Marshall notes, the meaning here cannot be to make tasteless or insipid, but all of the common modern translations adopt this meaning. The Hebrew root from which the Greek verb is taken here has the double meaning of saltlessness, as in tapel, and folly, as in tipla. So echoing maranthe here as foolish. So if salt has become foolish in the sense of useless, how can its saltiness be restored? Intini artutheseti here in the future tense, to season. And as Marshall again notes here, the explanation probably lies in the nature of Palestinian salt obtained by evaporation from the Dead Sea produced a mixture of crystals of common salt and carnallite. It would be easy to mistake crystals of bitter tasting carnallite for salt, which would be salt that had become tasteless, and therefore is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile, coprion, or the pile of crap, or you can say shit here, which echoes 13:8. Put a little more around the fig tree and see if it's fruitful. So if it's fruitful, if it's still salt, you can put it around there and see if something good comes from it. But if it's lost what it's meant for, then it's useless, and you throw it away, which contrasts with what we saw in the dinner scenes where those who are outside are called in. So the people on the margins of society in Jesus' world are brought to the middle, and the useless salt is thrown away. As my note below has, just as the elite will lose their association with other elite when they associate with those outside, so disciples who are unwilling to give everything to the discipleship commitment will be thrown out of that community, like Ananias and Sapphira, as we saw. Who are not thrown out, they just simply drop dead. And I just want to highlight now, Peter doesn't kill them. There's nothing in that. It's out of the very shame and embarrassment of being caught lying to the Holy Spirit that Ananias is humorously said to drop dead. And this ends with anyone who has ears to hear, something we heard Jesus say a number of other times, but it has to do with the implication of listening deeply. And he doesn't explain it here, and nobody questions him. So we readers are left to hear for ourselves. Do we have the ears to hear what the cost of discipleship is, and are we willing to pay the price? Our passage will change in the next chapter to those who are excluded, and that what God has to do with those who are lost and are needing to be found. See you for that next time.